40 years ago, I published a study of peak periods of American labor conflict, which has been mentioned, strike. And I dubbed those periods periods of mass strike, drawing on, of course, the work of Rosa Luxemburg. And as I've done this new edition, I've had the chance to look at the struggles of the last 15 years, the struggles of the 21st century, and I thought what would be fun to do today and might be helpful, we're all trying to figure out what does this mean, this series of things that include, of course, now most prominently the low-wage worker strikes and actions which have now, as we know, gone global. Going back to the Battle of Seattle, which really, I think, is a kind of marker of this new period of struggles. And some of the ones in between, how many of you remember the immigrant right demonstrations of 2006? Yeah, I figured. And the Wisconsin uprising, obviously Occupy Wall Street and the occupations and revolts it inspired in 600 US cities. The public education struggle in Chicago, which represents another type of struggle, but very much part of this further development of this same series. The main normal features of organized labor, a tremendous decline in union membership has been ongoing for 40 years, almost evaporation of strikes. That means that we're looking at maybe a tenth of the strikes and a tenth of the workers striking that there would have been, say, in the 1970s. But what we're now witnessing is the beginning of the end of what's been called one-sided class war. I thought something that would be a helpful way to approach this is to look at the similarities and differences between the struggles, what I tend to call the mini-revolts of the 21st century, and the periods of mass strike that I looked at in strike. So the 1877 and the Great Upheaval, the sit-down strikes of the 1930s, and so on. And I think we'll see both different similarities and differences, but let me start with the similarities. For most of American history, labor organization and strikes have centered on particular groups of workers and their relationship to their employer. One of the characteristics of the mini-revolts of the early 20th century is that they're primarily addressed to broad, long-term social concerns, things like globalization, immigration, worker rights, poverty, inequality, declining life prospects for working people, and public education, things that affect a large proportion of the working class. And that's been the case even where particular groups of workers, like the public service workers, public sector workers in Wisconsin, or the teachers in Chicago, have been at the center of these struggles. Nonetheless, the issues raised have been those broad social issues. A second thing that's quite distinctive is that these mini-revolts saw themselves and were seen as part of global movements responding to global problems that required global action to solve. And if you think about it for a minute, Seattle, obviously. Wisconsin, the way in which it was self-portrayed in connection with the Arab Spring, Tahrir's Square struggle, and on down to obviously the global strike of fast food workers that we have just witnessed, which, as far as I know, is the first actual global strike that there's ever been.
Well, sisters and brothers, I want to thank you for the invitation to be part of this discussion and to join this panel. Before I get to the heart of my contribution this evening, I want to quote Seamus Cook, who's a writer for Workers' Action and the Trade Unionists in Portland, Oregon. And in a recent article on Counterpunch, he talks about the organizing efforts of Oregon zoo workers who are bargaining for their first contract. They joined Portland Laborers Union Local 483. And Oregon's minimum wage is $9.10. And the Oregon zoo workers are using as a base of their contract negotiations of $15 minimum wage. So Seamus Cook states, using 15 to organize new workers or leverage power at the bargaining table is something new. The Zoo Workers Act complements the $15 ballot initiative approach. The two tactics reinforcing each other, hopefully towards the reinvigoration of the national labor movement. And if we can remember what is taking place at one of the most prestigious hospitals in the country, Johns Hopkins in Baltimore, where the workers who are organized by SEIU Local 1109 East are organizing around this question of a $15 minimum wage. I won't go over the points that Jeremy pointed out, the paradigm shift of Occupy Wall Street, the international explosion in Greece and Egypt and Spain and South Africa, or in fact even Wisconsin. But the low-wage worker strikes at home and abroad in many ways highlights the kind of questions that are posed to the working class and poor today. I would remind you that this year is the 80th anniversary of the great Minneapolis trucker strike. This is the 50th anniversary of Freedom Summer and even Johnson's question of the war on poverty. In over 30 states, highlighted by San Francisco, there are 30 ballot initiatives or protests organizing around a $15 minimum wage. And what city is at the epicenter of this struggle? Once again, we return back to the Battle of Seattle, but this time it's not on the question of globalization, but in fact it's about inequality in American society. Tomorrow, there will be discussions around Mayor Murray's $15 proposal. And what has been at the center of this struggle has been the newly elected socialist candidate and member of Socialist Alternative and originator of 15 now, Shama Sawant. And it is because of the movement and the mobilization of the Seattle working class and poor, and of course the low-wage workers, that Mayor Murray was forced to come with some type of proposal to the city council. Now it has corporate loopholes, it's inadequate, but because of the existence of 15 now, and the work of Shama Sawant, now the representatives of big business are forced to in fact discuss the question of a $15 minimum wage. 1.7 million people living below the federal poverty line, and 1 out of every 10 New Yorkers has a full or part-time job and still lives below the poverty line. Sisters and brothers, we are low-wage America. Over 50% of the jobs created has been low wage. That meaning those bringing home a salary or wages of $7 to $13 an hour. And this is in the midst of the so-called economic recovery. The U.S. today has the highest percentage of workers doing low-wage work than any other major industrialized nation in the world. Mainly women, mainly people of color, many of them in their late 20s, early 30s, and many of them with families, in fact. Today, 1 out of every 4 workers in the U.S. brings home wages that are at or below the poverty line. How do we get out of this crisis? Is the $15 minimum wage struggle a way to resuscitate the legacy of the American labor movement? I have 4 particular thoughts and ideas to which I would like to end on. First, I think we must return back to a clear and bold vision of a better world. As a socialist, I would say a socialist world. And the kind of industrial action that we've seen, or the kind of action by the low-wage workers, particularly the McDonald's workers, the fast food workers. We have to say SEIU has done a very important job in helping to organize. But see, we must be clear. that is not the kind of organizing that we saw in the 1930s and 40s and 50s, that kind of organic organizing on the shop floor. But the SEIU model has been top down. And if you were on the strike on that particular day, the workers came out, and by 12 noon, they were told to go back home. And so the SEIU, with all their various proxy organizations like New York, like NYCC, are using the workers like a tap to turn them on in front of the cameras and then turn them off when it's time to go home. And so we must be bold and say that to revitalize the labor movement, we must go back in some ways to the organic organizing that took place in the 30s and 40s, but underneath 21st century conditions. We also must mount an ideological struggle and make it clear where do we stand on these issues. That inequality flows out of the whole idea of capitalism in the market system. Point 2, the rebuilding of a revolutionary or left or socialist milieu in our trade unions. Some people would say, well, is that kind of passé? But the polls have shown, actually, that young people in general are favorable to the ideas of socialism, in fact. Meaning more favorable to anti-capitalist ideas. And so it's not very far-fetched, actually, to have a more deeper discussion about a system change. My third point is that there's extreme anger at the parties of big business. The average of a congressional member is $1 million. You do have a populist sentiment developing inside the Democratic Party. Mayor de Blasio, Elizabeth Warren, and I would even argue Ras Baraka in Newark, New Jersey. But what we have seen with the victory of Sharma Sawan, that the need to end the abusive relationship between labor and labor and the Democratic Party must be analyzed and must be dealt with. Sharma's victory, the Lorain County workers who ran independently from the Democrats and won. There's a Chicago initiative, an open socialist. Howie Hawkins was running as a Green Party member. He's running on a $15 minimum wage demand. If these campaigns are linked to grassroots movements, and they take on the life of these movements, like a $15 minimum wage, that's how Sharma won. And these demands are linked to consciousness. In many ways, that can help resuscitate really the power of the trade union movement and the potential of the trade union movement. And my final point, the sustaining of a grassroots and social struggle. We must remind this generation of the civil rights movement. We must remind this generation of the power of the labor movement, the women's movement and anti-Vietnam movement. And we must resuscitate the methods of struggle: strikes, nonviolent civil disobedience, occupations. My last point, the fight for 15 is just the beginning. A victory in Seattle will reverberate in the United States and around the world. But also it will give confidence to the American working class that they can win. And then we can instill a fighting spirit into the movement, raising a question about affordable housing, raising a question about nationalized health care, not Obamacare, but true nationalized health care. Today, Thomas Piketty is the darling of the left, despite he hasn't read Marx. And his talk of the progressive taxation is not a full answer to this crisis, in fact. Many people will go back to the New Deal of the 1930s and Roosevelt. Even some have hearkened back, and even Obama talks about the war on poverty, 1964, despite his policies has contributed to the inequality in American society. We would support any reform that is won through militant struggle. But we understand, in fact, that it's very precarious because the wheels of power are still in the hands of the ruling elite. And so I would pose the question that we must also wrest power out of the hands of the 0.01% and look at socialist planning and true workers' democracy to end the very misery that we're living through.